So let's go ahead and get started. People are still coming in, but if you're just joining us, Alice and I were just kind of hanging out, chit-chatting about world travel and our missing the different countries we've been able to go to. But we appreciate you being here. Why don't you go ahead and flip us forward, Allison,
Okay.
and we'll kind of introduce this series again. So again, this is a 6-part online event that's part of our Marketing AI conference. You don't need to register for the Marketing AI conference, which is coming up September 13th and 14th. It's a virtual event, 2-day virtual event. So this is a free component of that conference. You can kind of, be a part of any of these 6 sessions leading up to it, learn a little bit how AI works and actually see it in action. I think this is a real key for us, is so much of what we do at the Marketing AI Institute is try and make AI make sense to the average marketer. Like, you don't need to be a machine learning engineer or a data scientist to understand how this stuff works. And once you understand it, a whole world of possibilities open up to you, and the kinds of technologies you can go get to help you be better at your job and build smarter marketing and build smarter businesses. And that's really the whole fundamental idea of this series, is how do we help people find smarter technology to do their jobs better? And so today we're going to talk about how to build a global customer experience with AI. Now, this is going to focus on localization and translation services. And while you may not run a global brand and have the need necessarily for that, what you're going to learn is how these sorts of things work, though. How does translation work? What is the human component? What is the machine component? And that kind of information can be applicable and useful to you no matter what you do in your career. So I'm really excited for this. Why don't we go ahead, Allison, and flip to the next one? So Allison Yarborough is leading this conversation today. I'm just going to kind of be here hanging out and listening in as well and moderating Q&A. So Allison, why don't you take a moment and just tell us a little bit about yourself and your role with Lilt and about Lilt.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So hi, everyone. Great to meet you. I lead product marketing at Lilt, and Lilt is a technology-enabled language service provider. It sounds like my job is very well aligned with the organization, because it is my full-time job to take what our engineers and neural machine translation PhDs do and convert their very convoluted speak into something that somebody who doesn't have a full background in AI can understand. So I think this will be a good conversation today.
A great fit.
Yeah, exactly. But so yeah, what we provide is pretty similar to other language service providers out there. That means translation services, localization services. When you think about your global customers, that would be converting anything that you make in your first language, whether it's English or whatever the first language is that you use as your base language, and then making that available to your customers in other languages. And so where Lilt differs a little bit from what most companies do is what we deliver is not different, it's how we deliver it and what that how enables. And so that's what we'll get into a little bit later today.
Very cool. And then if you want to jump to the next one. So if you've been with us in any of the previous sessions, you've seen this slide, but these are the 6 companies that are doing the AI in action sessions. So this is our 3rd one this week, and then we'll have 3 more next week. And so just thanks to our sponsors. These are also sponsors of the Marketing AI conference. So if you do attend the virtual event, get a chance to interact with them during that week as well within the swap card platform that we're using for the AI event. And then the next page just shows us what those sessions are. So if you want to jump ahead, we had Celtra, automating workflows for advertising, create one ad, turn it into 20,000 or 2,000 variations, with the push of a button. Pandata talked to us yesterday about ethical AI and responsible AI. We've got Lilt today, and then next week we've got Persado, Market Muse, and Drift. So some amazing sessions next week as well. If you want to jump to the next one, Allison, this is just kind of housekeeping. If you're registered for this one, but not registered for the upcoming ones, you can still do that. So that bit.ly link there, the More AI in Action, will take you to the page where you can get registered for the upcoming ones. It's going to be the same link, same information, and these all will be available on demand. So if you do miss one and you want to catch it, we will send it a link after the fact and get you in there. We have our team available through chat today. Kathy's with us, our Chief Growth Officer. If you need any help, she's there to help you out. and then I'll be monitoring Q&A and chat throughout. If you have a question based on something Allison's talking about in the moment and you want to ask it, go ahead and throw it in there, and I'll try and jump in and answer or help ask and answer that question there. But we will leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A as well. These are scheduled to go about 45 minutes. We can go a little longer if there's a bunch of questions, but we should have you out of here at about 1/4 to the hour. So I think that's all I've got, and I'm going to turn it over to Allison to do her thing.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I have already introduced a little bit, so I won't spend too long talking about that. But just to level set on what we'll be talking about today, we'll be talking about how you can build a customer experience for all of your global customers using AI or applying AI. And so we'll start by talking about why we're even here today. So this premise of a digital first approach and how everyone in today's world is having to move to digital first, and what that means in terms of how you have to develop your marketing function and what you have to be thinking about in terms of longer term strategic planning. Then we'll talk about how AI can actually power scale for your program. So how you can take what human capabilities are available and actually enhance them. And we like to say, turn them into superheroes almost using AI and automation. Then we'll talk about a few success stories. So a few customers that we've worked with who we think have done a really good job of implementing this successfully. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. And the last thing that I'll say is that I am very open to having an interactive discussion. So please don't hesitate to drop questions and we can do the Q&A at the end, but also happy to sort of address those on an ongoing basis. Okay, so just to level set, won't spend too long on this because I think everyone knows at this point, COVID-19 drastically changed the landscape and how marketers have to think about how they engage with customers and how they do their job. Everyone moved to digital in this 10-month period, or 4-month period. We had about 10 years of growth just because everyone during all of the lockdowns was forced to move to digital. And so you have all of these, there always has been a segment of consumer populations who have been online, but this really was the catalyst to say, okay, the world is digital first, everyone has to be digital now. And so that has some implications for how marketers and how businesses think about the customers they engage with. And one of the facets of a digital first experience or a digital first customer is that they expect to be able to access anything from your business across any channel at any time. So that could be phone, that could be browser, that could be via an ad or via an app. They really expect that wherever their digital device is, you're there and you're able to communicate with them. And so what that means is that you have to, as they expect this sort of seamless experience across all of the touch points, you really have to start thinking strategically about, okay, have I actually captured and codified each of the touch points that I have with this customer throughout their customer journey and throughout the funnel? And am I sure that I'm really communicating my company and our brand in the way that I'd like to consistently across all of those touch points? So what we're looking at here is effectively the marketing funnel. So it starts at awareness, moves all the way through to advocacy, and marketing plays along most of this chain. So starting over here at the very first touch point, if they discover your company, maybe via a press release or some sort of paid media, online ads, maybe they then go to your website, they check out your blog, maybe they sign up for your email list, moving them all the way through to conversion. There's a little period in here where maybe marketing doesn't engage so much, but then marketing picks it up again at retention through to advocacy through social media, newsletter, blog, etc. So this is a pretty complex journey that we're looking at here, and it takes a lot of work to map all of this out. So that's just in English. And then think about the complexity of that in English, and then think about, okay, let's say you feel confident that you've really nailed that down with your English speaking customers, or whatever your first language is. We'll use English as an example here for sort of the base. Then you have to think about, okay, if I actually want to go and deliver that same experience digitally to all of my customers across all of the countries and markets that we have, how do I do that? And looking at what we have pictured here, let's say that this is a global customer in Japan. If you're thinking about that customer in Japan and how they receive your advertising, your website, your newsletter, your promotions, your emails, all of it, it's a lot of touch points and it's a lot of content to take from one language and convert into another and make sure that it's still that seamless experience that we have talked about being really important. So in addition to that sort of complexity of delivering that to all of your global customers, there's this factor that content volumes are growing exponentially. One of the impacts of this move to digital first was that content volumes just absolutely exploded. From 2021 to 2025 alone, the volume of data and content that's out there and generated by enterprises is projected to double. And so as a marketer, that can be somewhat overwhelming because you sort of say, okay, I have a hard enough time keeping up with the content as is. If it's going to grow that fast and I'm expected to then communicate with, people in not just one language, but many, how do I actually do that? And, I'm not sure who we have listening in terms of sort of have engaged with localization or not, but if you have engaged with localization in some capacity and or you're doing this as a marketing function, what you know is that there is a set amount of human linguists out there. So when you think about sort of the full volume of human linguists that are available out there to translate content, they sort of cap out. And for a long time, that has been okay. There's been this sort of gap. There were more translators available than there was content that needed to be translated. Everything was great. As we move to digital first and we need to localize all of that content into different languages, that simply doesn't work anymore. And if you look over here in the top right, you can see that the volume of content that businesses need to localize for marketing will actually be far more than humans can possibly keep up with. And so this is where we think AI and MT comes into it. And by applying AI and MT to the content that you need to localize, you can actually close that gap and use machines to generate that efficiency that you need and that productivity to close that gap when you can't just throw more humans at the problem.
And also for people who aren't as aware of kind of this market and maybe don't do globalization and localization as much, is it mostly an outsourced function? Like are most organizations that do this finding either consulting firms or service firms that offer this as a service, or are there some that actually hire and staff for this kind of function?
Yeah, that's a great question. The large majority of companies out there choose to outsource this.
Yeah.
And that's mainly because it's just not a core competency of a business. There are a lot of logistics and sort of institutional expertise that go into knowing how to effectively run a localization process. It's far more complex than you would inherently realize just because there are so many different style guides that need to be involved in workflows, and there's a lot of formatting of different file types and figuring out how to convert them properly. And so most companies just say, you know what, honestly, it's easier just to outsource this, have a third party manage it. And over time, most companies develop pretty strong relationships with their localization vendor, and it becomes very akin to a partnership.
One thing to note, this isn't really a question, more of like a recent observation I've had. So like our marketing institute, as an example, we have global reach, but by no intention, like we're not doing anything to global, get the global reach in terms of translation of our content.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when I think about it though, it's like, well, we probably should, and we're a startup. Like it's, we raised $1 million seed round, but we're in essence a startup company, with like 4 employees. And I don't have this strategy, but I have many times in the last year thought about, well, should we be translating the content we're creating? Should we be localizing the emails we have? And like, I don't know that 3 years ago it would have been possible, but I do feel like some of the things you're going to talk about today in terms of the leaps forward in AI technology, plus the human in the loop piece, might actually make it to where companies like ours that don't have this kind of strategy, it might be more possible today than it would have been 3 years ago. So just, again, more of like a observation that if you're sitting here and you're like, well, I don't have a global audience, it's not a big deal. Content is global. Search is global. Like you may want to build an audience, even if you're not selling to that audience. So just something to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a really good point that you raised. And we use the phrase global experience, but you could also very easily use multilingual. I mean, what we see, for example, with a lot of our big American institutions is that Spanish-speaking customers are just as big of a base as English speaking. And so really, the way that we encourage companies to think about it, and we do strategic planning sessions also where we walk customers through okay, let's take a really close look at your go-to-market strategy and who your customer segments are, and then make sure that you're meeting sort of those customer segments that you're targeting.
Yeah, good way to think about it.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about the fact that there's this gap, and that as companies think about how they can communicate with their, multilingual customers, that there is generally more content than can possibly be translated just with human translators. And again, for people who have a little bit less experience in this field, it can get really expensive really fast, because the way that the whole industry works, it's charged by cost per word, or companies are charged per word. And so when you think about the volumes of content that you're localizing, it can get very costly very quickly. So what we are excited to sort of present to the world, and what I think we'll talk about today, is how you can actually use machines and AI to accommodate some of that, achieve productivity, and actually reduce some of those costs so that it's more scalable.
And on the previous slide, you had mentioned MT, that's machine translation. Danielle, yes. I think was okay, just for everybody's clarification.
Yeah,
cool.
Great question. Yep, machine translation, exactly. All right, so as we think about, we've explained this general process of thinking about a localization program at scale, thinking about your different customer segments, and thinking about how you'd like to reach them across their customer journey. So you have this huge volume of content, and there are a few ways that you can actually apply AI to help you scale and develop a program that can reach as many customers as you need to deliver this holistic, seamless customer experience. So, and we'll talk about each of these in bits and pieces today, but there's quality. So thinking about the fact that, I'm talking to a bunch of marketers, so I know I can say this and you all will understand that quality is of the utmost importance. Your brand is everything. You develop your brand and you want to make sure that you're communicating your brand to customers across every touch point. So you certainly can't sacrifice that. And there are ways that AI and automation can actually help you improve your quality and make sure that you achieve that consistency across all of your content. Productivity is a huge one. This is where we'll actually start in a second, but what you can do is you can actually apply machines and AI to the repetitive, mundane tasks that humans could do but don't necessarily need to do. Save your human brain power for sort of those higher level challenges that need to be thought through, and get the machine to do the components that are repetitive, can be learned very quickly, and don't take a lot of thought capacity. With both of those, of course, you achieve significant cost savings. Machines are very cost effective. Human labor is very expensive. And so as you move more and more of that work to the machines, you're able to achieve significant cost savings. And then all that boils together to say, okay, if we can reduce the cost, increase the productivity, and still maintain or even improve the quality, then we can actually build a really scalable program and extend our reach pretty significantly and actually improve how we engage with customers. Okay, so we'll talk through a few things today. The first that is very core to how we recommend companies think through applying AI to the localization process is that historically in the industry, there's been this huge human labor cost because there are human translators, human linguists who do all of the translations. And as we talked about, there simply is more content out there than you possibly could address just with human linguists. And so what Lilt developed was actually a neural machine translation engine that predicts, so that's just machine translation. To give you an analogy that is a little bit more day to day, when we say machine translation, you can think of that as Google Translate, basically. So similar to what would come out of Google Translate, that is generally what comes out of neural machine translation engines. So our application of it, though, is a little bit different, where we developed this neural machine translation engine, and it actually predicts the best translation for the linguist. So there's a little system, it predicts it, and the human translator sees that prediction and says, yes, this is right. No, this isn't right, or they make some tweaks, and then they say, okay, yes, this is the right translation. Now, that's great that you can see some efficiency there, where there is the machine doing part of the work. Where the AI comes into it, and where it really creates a foundation for scalability, is that as that human says, yes, this is right, no, this is not right, or makes those edits, the machine actually takes that as feedback and learns from it. So that you could consider that feedback a data input effectively that goes into the machine learned from it and says, okay, next time I do this, I know that this is the best translation, so I'm going to make that suggestion. So it takes that feedback in and it sends it back into the platform. And then the next time the machine makes a suggestion, and this happens in a matter of seconds. So in as little as 3 lines of translation, you're seeing the machine learning in real time from that feedback. It makes better and better suggestions over time, so that the linguist ultimately, when it's really optimized, can go through and say, yes, that's right, yes, that's right, yes, that's right. And it's only occasional that the human has to go in and make some edits or give feedback. And so we call that human in the loop, that whole process where you have the machine as the base, the human feedback actually trains the neural machine translation engine, and it learns from that and uses that to do better and better over time. So
and this is just a representation, real quick, Allison. Like we talk about on the previous sessions, and if you've heard us, attend any other courses or presentations we've done, this is that concept of machine learning. It's the very literal function of AI, where the machine takes in data and learns and makes better predictions. That's the core of what you see again in your daily life in Netflix and Google Maps and Spotify and like everywhere where machines are recommending things to you based on your behavior, your Facebook newsfeed, your Twitter newsfeed, your LinkedIn feed. All of it uses the same core concept of take data in, behavioral data, adapt the recommendations moving forward based on that data. So this is just applying it to translation, but it's the same core concept of what AI does.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's exactly right. Thank you. That's really good context. One thing that I will highlight, and I think I don't exactly know which other topics you'll be covering sort of across the spectrum of the conference, but one area where there's a huge opportunity for AI to make a difference is not in sort of the standalone functions, but when it actually empowers humans. So this premise of elevating what the human does and making them superhumans, or as we like to refer to them, super translators. Mm-hmm. So with the application of this, what we've seen is that our linguists are able to be 3 to 5 times as productive. And so if you think about as a business, when you want to go live on your marketing website and you have some new content that needs to be localized, it allows you to do that much, much faster than you could if you were just using humans to do this.
I think it's a key point because some people do have this fear that we're just going to lose jobs. But to your point, there was a supply and demand issue before this. You didn't have enough linguists and translators. So you're still working with the people you have. They didn't lose their jobs. They're just able to be more efficient, more productive, redistribute some resources, or drive more revenue, accelerate revenue, because they can do the work 3 to 5 times greater than they previously could. And that's, yes, like in the next 10 years, will people lose some jobs because of AI? Probably. Like there will probably be some people who do a very specific thing that will be automated, but in most cases, it's just going to augment, whether you're a content marketer, email marketer, an advertiser, like it's just going to take away that repetitive data-driven stuff and let you amplify what you're uniquely capable of doing. And I think that translation is such a perfect example of kind of encompassing what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. Great. Okay, so this is the very core of what we've developed that leads to these significant productivity gains. If you think about that slide that I showed with the sort of the 4 major components of what AI can achieve for you, the next component of it is that thinking back to this neural machine translation engine that I just talked about, what you can then do at scale is, so the way we do it, at least, there may be other companies do this as well, that neural machine translation engine is customized to each company. And so over time, it learns from your brand and it learns exactly what terms, tone, style you like to do. And it can always be used for 2 purposes. It can always be used, A, to give those suggestions to the translator, as we just talked about, but it can also be used to generate raw machine translation. So when you think about, and the difference from sort of a Google Translate or any other sort of public-facing translation machine that you would have seen, is that because it's customized to your data and it learns more and more over time, the quality of that machine translation output increases substantially from that human feedback. And so what we see is a lot of systems generating content, or a lot of businesses generating content in their various business systems. So that could be, your website platform, if you use a storage drive to store some of your marketing collateral, wherever all of your content lives, we see companies pumping that into one global experience platform, which has a neural machine translation engine at the very base of it. All of that content is translated, and as all of that content is translated, that by humans, that human feedback goes into that neural machine translation engine and trains that engine to be better and better. And so companies then start saying, okay, let's look at our content more strategically and say, which components of it is the quality of the utmost importance, and we really want that to be human translated, and then which components of it, quality is important, but speed is more important, or cost is more important, and so we're going to go pure machine translation. And so from a marketing scope, what we see people doing a lot of the time is they'll say, okay, our most of our website is the first thing customers see. We really want that to be human translated, but maybe our knowledge base or some of our support content, we're not really sure exactly who looks at it, and we're not sure how important it is. So we're going to use the engine to just produce machine translation, put it up on our website. It's sort of a less visited page, and then over time refine if we need to translate it by humans.
One thing I'll highlight there real quick is, the point you made about customizing it over time to the brand is so critical, because we've been looking at AI tech for the last 5 years, the Institute, doing vendor spotlights, assessing the technology, doing product demos. And so many times there are these scoring models or predictions about what you should write and things like that, that are anonymized data. They're just basically taking a bunch of anonymized data, making predictions that could apply to any business. And it doesn't learn your business over time. So I'll give you a real practical example. Social media, when to share something. So historically in our industry, there would be these reports done. Someone would do research and say, okay, publish tweets at 11:05 Eastern time for the greatest probability of it being clicked or, engaged with. It's like, okay, that's great. But everyone who read this study is now publishing at 11:05. And what if our audience isn't in the same time zones as the sample size that they took that data from? So if you were using AI to help you do social shares, you would want that algorithm to learn what creates the most engaging social shares over time for your brand. What content are you putting in? What hashtags? What time are you sharing it? Because it's not going to be universal. And so you really, once you understand how AI really works, whether it's for this kind of product you're looking for, or social, or advertising, or content, you're going to want to be investing in technology that gets smarter and gets more personalized to your brand and your consumers, because to create this kind of global experience Allison's talking about, that's what has to happen. It has to be personalized. And anonymized data from a bunch of people that gets lumped into one recommendation engine isn't going to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I also don't know if any of the other sessions have touched on the difference between rule-based versus an engine that truly learns, but that, just generally, that is a good question to ask when you're engaging with companies that purport to be AI companies. You should ask, okay, what type of artificial intelligence do you have driving this? A lot of companies will say that they have sort of artificial intelligence technology, but really it's just a bunch of rules that the machine never actually learns.
The data scientists just write new rules, and it doesn't get smarter until the data scientists write the rules. Yeah, it's a great point. Actually, Cal, yesterday, if you were in the ethics one, that he actually started with an almost exact slide. What is and isn't AI? It's like, if it's rules-based, written by humans, it is not AI. If it's learning on its own and adapting the rules and getting smarter on its own, it's AI. It's a good fundamental way to think about, is it or is it not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, I want to make sure that I leave some time at the end for questions, but I do want to share a few success stories of companies that we're working with that have done this really well and seen really positive gains from it. And I think before I jump, these are two bigger companies, so it's important to say the larger the company, the larger the gains, but you can achieve the gains at any scale effectively. So A6 is one that we work with, and they were in a scenario where they had a large number of product SKUs and product descriptions that they needed to localize on an ongoing basis. As they release new products, they needed it to go up on their website, and they needed to be accessible for customers around the world. At the time, I think they were doing 14 languages. Now they're doing 25 with the Olympics, but a number of languages effectively. They needed to, let's say they're releasing a sneaker to market, they need to have all of those product descriptions ready to go up on the website right away. And they were finding that it was a very slow manual process, and they simply could not keep up with the volume and go to market on time. And so they were missing a number of their sort of product releases. They were lagging in any other language because they simply couldn't do it with humans, or with pure human translation. And so they have partnered with Lilt very effectively, and they rolled it out across 14 languages, now 25. And so the whole process for that was Lilt initially set up this custom neural machine translation engine for ASICs. That engine makes suggestions to an ASIC specific team of linguists. And as they translate all of the ASICs content, it goes back into that engine and just trains that engine on ASICs content. So over time, the machine learns, okay, what is ASIC's tone and style? How do they like to talk about their company? What's their brand? And what voice do they want to come through? As well as learning all of the different product terms and terminology that needs to be consistent throughout every single language across the website. And so they found it to be highly successful. I never remember these numbers, so let me pull this up here. Okay, so through their sort of localizing their product content with Lilt, ASICS was able to achieve a 70% cost savings, which is pretty powerful. Localization teams often are not given more money, they're just told to do more with the same budget. And so that was a pretty powerful sort of impact there. But more importantly, they were able to improve their turnaround times by 60%. So thinking about the fact that all of these products were launching and they didn't have it localized on time across all of the different languages, they were able to achieve 60% increase in sort of speed of turnaround time, and able to go to market. And then the third component of it that was pretty important was that they found that the quality stayed the same in comparison to historical pure human translations that they had done, which was really important because there often is this big concern around, oh, will the quality be worse? Is the machine translation going to do X, Y, and Z? And in this case, the human is always in control. So the human makes the ultimate decision as to what that content should be. So that we would consider that a pretty strong success story. And ASICS has been really helpful, not only in sort of working with us to activate this, but actually giving us suggestions for where we need to go to continue meeting changing market dynamics. Another company that we would consider a success story is Intel. And so their problem was a little bit different. They had a problem where, as I just mentioned, they were being asked to do about 2 times as much content translation with the same budget. And Intel is a very large program. And so as you can imagine, there was a pretty large budget there. And so they actually moved all of their translation services over to Lilt, and doing that, they were able to save about 40% in their costs, which at scale is a pretty big achievement, but they also were able to localize 2 times as much content, which is a pretty impactful difference. And this was a similar thing where they have a custom neural machine translation engine. Translators that translate Intel content are given suggestions from that neural machine translation engine. And as they translate, their human feedback goes into that engine, training it and making it better and better so that it learns. And the reason why Intel is an especially good success story for us is that their engine, they're part of our design partnership. But what we have found is that through the content that we've localized with them, the neural machine translation engine has learned and become good enough that they can now use that content for pure machine translation as well, which is really exciting. And so then they can start to think about, okay, these segments of content, and this is the exact discussion we're having with them right now, where it's okay, these segments of content are human translation. These we just want to do machine translation, and we feel confident that the machine output is good enough that we can do that. So that's been really exciting as well.
The one thing I would just note on both of those, what we always advise people is there's two ways to get started with AI if you're just trying to find where to start. And there's the use case base, which is find something you spend a bunch of time on that AI can help you potentially do it more efficiently and start there and test it. The other is a problem-based model where you have something where you're investing significant time and money, and you can assign a value to doing it smarter. And so in both these cases, the two main outcomes we always tell people is like reduce costs, accelerate revenue. Like those are the two main reasons you would ever use AI. You don't want to just go get AI because it's the hot term. You want to look at your business and say, are there ways we can either drive efficiency and therefore reduce the costs, or create a greater output that accelerates the growth of the company? And if you can't do either of those, then you don't need AI. Like, it's just do what you're doing and find smarter ways to do it. But that's really what AI does. And in both those examples, that was kind of a good overview of how you can think about it.
Yeah, thank you. I would actually add a third use case to that, or sort of a third driver, which is if you want to improve your global quality and consistency, AI can be really beneficial for that as well. I mean, this is something we talk about all the time, but there are just certain things. If a human is involved, there's a lot of room for error. And as you have a machine that jumps in and starts thinking through, okay, how can we make this consistent across the board? You actually can improve the quality and the consistency because you have a machine checking for all of those things and learning for that. So, little things that here and there might slip through the cracks with a human or multiple humans managing it. When it's one machine managing it, you sort of eliminate that risk of error. So that's a sort of third component there as well. Okay, great. And then lastly, and I know we're sort of running up on time here, what I would say for those of you who are starting, if you would like to explore an AI-powered global customer experience, there are a few things you want to think about. You probably want to have, and this is a pretty comprehensive slide, but these are things that we think are all pillars of building this global customer experience. So we think about it, and I'll go through a few of these in detail, but we think about it in two major segments. There's this component of creating and deploying multilingual experiences. So that's thinking through all of those touch points that we talked about earlier and thinking about how you can deliver the right content across each of those touch points in different languages. And then there's this component of managing, analyzing, and actually improving the experience. And this is, again, where the machine learning comes into it, when you can sort of look at the output, say, okay, what's happening here? And then say, okay, what changes can we make to actually improve this? So thinking about those two big buckets, there are a few major things that you would want to think through as you are engaging in this. The first is that you'd want to make sure you're working with a provider where you do have some sort of translation engine at the very base of it. Again, thinking back to this theme of there's just more content than we can possibly achieve with humans, you do want a machine and probably a technology-enabled provider who can say, we have realized that the technology is needed to facilitate this process. You certainly want to have a quality control and a lens to your quality and consistency across the board. Not only just having that as a focus, but also actually having machine functionality that can help you double and triple check what you're delivering to your customers across all of those touch points. I won't get into the details here, but thinking about all of those touch points, and if you just try and think through all of the different platforms that you use to deliver that content across touch points, it can be pretty overwhelming. So you definitely want to work with a system that can connect and easily facilitate the exchange of content to and from those different systems. What we find often is that there's a lot of room for human error when you don't have that connectivity. So if you have it, it both saves you a lot of time, but it also reduces the risk of error and delays and bottlenecks and things like that. And then this third component, where if you think about managing that whole program and that whole experience, you want to be able to do two things. One, you want to be able to manage your linguistic assets. So I imagine a big theme of this conference has been sort of data and how you manage data, because it ultimately trains the machine. You can think of everything that you've ever localized as a data point and a linguistic asset. And so you want to be really careful that you are proactively managing all of that. That could be previous translations. That could be if you have a list of brand specific terms and a term base that you want to make sure you're keeping consistent throughout. That could be style guides, anything else that goes into that process. It's all a data point, and you want to make sure that you're managing it strategically. And then the last component of it is insights and data. And so actually taking the performance of what you're doing and saying, okay, what are we seeing here, and how can we use that information to continuously improve and fill gaps in our customer experience? Okay, and then this is just a little bit of a preview. Everything that we've showed, I think, would indicate that at some point, most marketing teams will have to move to leveraging machines in some way to support localization. Thinking through this premise of there's just too much content out there. But Lilt recently did a state of the localization industry survey and released a report in relation to it. We're actually releasing our marketing specific report on September 9th, and this is a little bit of a sneak preview. But what that report shows is that 52% of marketers and marketing departments actually aren't using machine translation in any capacity currently for their localization process, which we thought was a pretty powerful stat and a little bit shocking to us. But I think that goes to show this is definitely a nascent area and something that a lot of marketing teams are just starting to explore or just starting to think through, because it has historically been pretty manageable just with sort of the human component of it. And it's just in the past year or two that there's really been this impetus and this need to say, okay, our customers are digital first. How do we actually accommodate this volume of content? So I'll pause there. I think there are a few questions in the chat.
Yeah,
and
got
then
a few. Yeah, if you want to, let's run through those next two slides real quick, and then maybe we'll just shut down the video and just chat, or shut down the slide. So if you're
Great.
not familiar with the Institute, you can check it out at marketinginstitute.com. Tons of content resources there. And then marketingacademy.ai is our online education platform. So there's 5 certification courses and like 3 or 4 dozen individual courses. So if you're trying to kind of advance your learning journey, it's a great place to start. And then the last slide is about Marketing AI Conference, which I mentioned at the beginning. It's coming up September 13th and 14th. It is virtual, so no matter where in the world you are, you can be there. And there's a AI in Action 25 code for 25% off. I will tell you, if you're on this live, not watching this on demand, pricing goes up tomorrow night. So I would use that now because the price goes up $50. So I think you actually save quite a bit by doing it before tomorrow night. So with that, yeah, we've got some questions. So why don't we go ahead and turn off the presentation and we can get started on the questions. So the first one, this is kind of a 2-parter. So you talked a lot about this idea of pure machine translation versus human translation and trying to determine which things get which. So one, I wanted to ask about the strategy behind that, and like who kind of leads that strategy, deciding which gets which. Is that you have to be really trained to do this, or is like a marketer figuring this out? And the second is, what is the criteria to determine when machine translation is enough? Is there a confidence level achieved? Like what is the metric or the KPI that helps you figure that out, or isn't there one and it's just kind of a judgment call?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, great questions. So the first part of that, I will say, it really varies by organization. I know the answer, it depends, is probably not that satisfying, but it really depends on how savvy you and your company are in terms of thinking through that. Some companies have really, really strong, robust departments that it's pretty much their job to think through their content strategy. And when you see that scenario, you see organizations where they have a really robust content strategy in their base language, and then they also have a really robust strategy in their other languages as well. Now, of course, that's not feasible for every single company out there. And I think that the important thing to note is that it's not a black and white situation. It's not sort of like we have a robust strategy or we have no strategy at all. There are incremental steps that can be taken. And ideally, I mean, this is generally outsourced to different partners, and your partners should be able to help you. So for example, we work with a number of sort of mid-market companies who it's sort of their first time doing it. And they're like, well, we don't even know where to start. And great, we can help you with that. We can walk you through that. Your partner should be able to help you with that. And then if you are at a company where you already do have that built out, then your partner should be able to weave themselves into the strategy that you have and help you enhance it.
So that actually kind of leads to another question is, we'll often ask with AI providers, AI tech providers, what is the minimum data set needed, or what are the minimum requirements for this to be a viable technology for us? And so you'd mentioned some mid-markets, obviously you work with bigger enterprises, but is there a kind of a checklist people should think through to know if they need a localization strategy and a global experience strategy? Or do you see it as universal to every business, or is it really specific size businesses or specific markets or specific audiences?
Yeah, good question. I think it ties very closely to your go-to-market strategy.
Okay.
So in your go-to-market strategy, if you have one customer base or that speak one language, then you may not need a localization strategy and a global customer experience strategy because you don't have global customers. The minute that you step into the territory where you say, well, we have our primary customer segments that we'd like to target, and they all speak one language, but we have the secondary market, and we'd like to start thinking about how we can maybe reach them and engage them, that's when you should start thinking through, okay, how are we approaching this? Because something that blows our minds a lot that we see is that companies spend, some of the bigger companies spend up to millions of dollars developing this really top-notch global or customer experience for the first language. And then the second language comes along and they're sort of like, well, I guess we'll just see what happens. And, if that market is valuable enough that you really want to target them and try and make headway there, then you should be thinking about, okay, how can we provide the same experience for those customers as we do for customers in our base language?
And would you think, I'm just thinking back, like we had a couple of years ago, we had a very large manufacturing company, and they worked in, I don't know, 50 countries. And we led a project to do 3 websites in different languages. But that was it. You created the sites in the different languages. But now that you're talking about this, like I'm thinking through realistically, the strategy should have been like, if you're starting a brand today in one language, you're often going to start creating content, use content marketing to build an audience. And then, then you're going to get into demand gen, and then you're going to, build all the other components. So this idea of just like flipping on a website in another language, that's not enough. Like you really need to build the content. So, if I'm thinking through, like you were saying, if I'm going to go into another market next year, or if I have a developing market that's very important to us, you should probably be thinking in that customer journey, like around that awareness stage, like really starting to create content in those languages so that you can build that journey. Am I thinking about that from the right perspective?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we often do see that that's exactly the approach companies take, where they flip on the website and that's sort of the first component of it. And something that this can seem like a pretty intimidating process to think about that whole customer journey more holistically. And we like to say, it's not an all or nothing game. It's sort of like pieces of a puzzle, and the more pieces you can get, the better of an experience you're providing. So that's not to say that, localizing a website is great, and that is often where companies start. And that can be your foundation to then say, okay, we know this is somewhere in the sort of awareness to consideration phase. Let's start to think a little bit more broadly about the other touch points in maybe just one phase. And then let's think about the touch points across the entire funnel. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It can be sort of a step-by-step. We'll bring in one more touch point, then bring in one more touch point. But that is ultimately what you would like to get to, is a whole view of every engagement your customer has with you from beginning to end.
Well, this has been fantastic. Maybe we'll end with one final question. If someone is just getting started in this, thinking about their localization and global experience strategy, what would be like kind of one word of advice you'd give them? And then for these bigger brands that maybe have been doing this for years or decades, but they're looking realizing, oh my gosh, the technology has raced forward in the last 3 to 5 years and we're not doing this. Maybe what would be kind of the wisdom you would impart on those 2 personas before we head out?
Yeah. So for the sort of just starting out segment, I would say, sort of thinking back to this premise of flipping on a switch and turning on the website, everyone thinks it will be just a super easy thing to do. Okay, translate it, sure, great. But there is a little bit more complexity to it, because you do have to be thinking about not just the literal translation, but also how you want to communicate to the consumers in that different market. And so there are certain things in terms of tone, style, cultural norms, even like phrases. A good example that we like to use is the Facebook like button. If you were to translate that into a different language, it wouldn't mean anything. So there are some cultural nuances that you have to think about as you're entering these new markets. And typically what you want to do is develop a style guide for your company so that when the linguists are going out and translating into all the different languages, they can use that as the base so that you ensure that you have consistency across all of your different locales. And then I would say for the bigger enterprises, I think something that has really, I've been at Lilt for about 1.5 years now, and something that has really hit me is that the localization industry is very, very traditional. And so for a long time, there hasn't been a lot of technological change. And so sometimes it can seem really scary. And the biggest barrier there often actually is the change management. But in reality, if you find a partner who can help you through that, it doesn't have to be that scary, and it can lead to, I mean, with some of our Fortune 500s, we see cost savings in the multi-million dollars, and improvements in consistency, and the quality is the same or often better because we actually have that second and third set of eyes. So I think my advice to bigger enterprises that already are doing this would be to not be afraid of technology. It doesn't have to be so scary, and it actually means that you can spend your time on the more strategic things and sort of push the sort of repetitive, mundane things over to the machine.
Well, thank you again, Allison. This has been fantastic. I mean, this is an area where I haven't spent as much time studying as a marketer. I've been doing this for 20 plus years and work with a lot of international companies and a lot of companies that, should have been localizing even in the US. And, I just think it's been a gap for us in terms of something we were even able to talk to clients about. So this is really valuable. I appreciate you taking the time and energy to do this. We obviously appreciate Lilt's support of the community and the conference, and everybody who joined us today. Thanks for being here. And Allison, thank you again. This is great. We'll talk travel and food next time.
Great. Sounds great. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We hope to see you next week for the last 3 sessions of AI in Action. Thanks again.